So anybody in the United States already knew that that was not true, because there were filed documents that showed there was no paternal interest, and that matter had been closed. And it was also slanderous to tell another country that I had paranoid schizophrenia, because I had never been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. And in fact, even when I was in Wenatchee, nobody was saying I was paranoid schizophrenic. The only thing that somebody in Wenatchee had said about me was this one time, after a half-an-hour visit with this woman named Julie Rickard, who was working for the Columbia Valley Community Health Center. And she said that she suggested borderline. She said nothing about paranoid schizophrenia. She mentioned maybe at one point something about paranoia, briefly, not paranoid schizophrenia. And after I'd had counseling with Brett McDonald, she said that she absolutely disagreed that there was any kind of paranoid schizophrenia at all. And then when those two mental health professionals saw me immediately prior to my leaving the country with my son, both of those mental health professionals concurred that there was no mental illness. So when the United States was defaming me by saying I was paranoid schizophrenic, they did so on an official level to Canadian officials, who then had this document with them. And I looked over and I saw that, and I realized my own attorney, this is the guy who's supposed to be representing me, he didn't show me this. He didn't even bring it up. He said nothing to me about any of that, and I had a right to look at my records. And of course I will get into this later, but much later, when after I was thrown back to the United States, I asked for a copy of the file and the records from Canada. And Canada was very hostile to me. I didn't realize at the time that Canada had always been working against me. I asked for the records, and they said, we will not give them to you. And they were really hostile and said the only way you can get them is if you come into Canada and pick them up in person, because we have to see you in person. And they knew that was impossible for me at the time, because I had no money, and my car was there because they took my car from me, and they forced me to leave Canada without my vehicle. So exactly how was I going to get to Canada without transportation when they stole my car? I mean, what was that? Was that some sort of a weird revenge thing because somebody had, and I had some kind of crazy concocted idea that, well, if Mike Nichols, their Canadian spawn, hadn't successfully assassinated and killed me in the rollover, and since he died, and you know, now they're going to take another car. I mean, first I have him totaling my car, ruining my car from that rollover and accident, assassination attempt. I need to clarify that as an assassination attempt, because he did it specific. He hijacked my car, and then he rolled it only when he heard that my seatbelt was off. He thought it was off. So let's see, Canadian Jeans rolls my car, totals it, and ruins it, and then they steal my next car from me. So they never allowed me to see any of the records. I still have never seen any of the Canadian records, and since I've been in the United States after that time, the United States has worked very hard at keeping me from getting those records. Every single public defender I've had has refused to request the records, even though they are pertinent to they were pertinent to the case with my son. And they refused to ask for them, even though I told them where they were. It had bearing on what the state of Washington did, and what the Department of State did, and what the FBI did with regard to my son. And several times I asked them to obtain that evidence and documentation, and they refused. So the United States has never wanted me to see the extent of their defamation against me and their illegal collusion. And Canada hasn't wanted me to see any of that information either, because they've made it very hard for me to obtain these records and known that I couldn't get them. So after we were in this courthouse, I see this document, and as soon as I saw that document about my being supposedly paranoid schizophrenic, and this is like after 1 year. It had only been 1 year that I wasn't working, and prior to that I had been working my entire life too. And the only reason I hadn't worked for the last year was because of medical injuries from the childbirth and being tortured, but also medical injuries. So it wasn't like I had this long history or any kind of record at all of having a mental illness. But that's what was in the report that this lawyer had. So I saw that, and I stood up and I said, Your Honor, they said that my lawyer was speaking. They said they were going to have somebody speak for me, some kind of a representative, you know, pat me on the shoulder and speak for me, because I wasn't capable of speaking for myself. Is the kind of is the sort of thing that they wanted to have in their records. You know, if they could have. So basically, I stood up and I said, I don't want someone else to speak for me. I can speak for myself. And the judge kind of perked up at that, and he looked like, okay, he was looking forward to a lively interaction now. I mean, I'm sure every judge gets bored of the kind of cases they have to hear, and that was going to spice things up a little bit, because I stood up for myself, and against what my lawyer wanted me to do and this other guy was trying to pull. And he said, then go ahead. But then this judge and my attorney refused. The judge refused to allow me to talk at all about political asylum. He kept cutting me off. And he allowed me to talk. He only wanted me to address questions he had about insufficient funds. That's the only thing he would allow me to speak about. And then I tried to talk to him about other things, but he wouldn't hear it. And as I say, he cut me off every time I was starting to go towards the whole matter of political asylum, and then what these officials had done. And so basically, he ruled against me. He said that he found me guilty of having trying to be a Canadian citizen illegally, which was that entire characterization of the hearing was a lie. I wasn't trying to be a Canadian citizen illegally at any point. And then, he said that I had to be taken back to the United States. So then they put me into, they took this one guard that was standing there and watching the entire hearing was supposed to drive me in a van back to the border and basically dump me off. And as I was walking out of the courthouse, I looked over at the Canadian side, the Canadian's attorney that was arguing for Canada, and for the Middletons, by the way, because I'm sorry, but they were always involved, and they've always been involved with the United States, and it's really disgusting how we have United States money that's funding United Kingdom Middletons, but they decide to torture their own children and kids. That's pretty sick. And at that time, I had no idea who the Middletons were. I had no clue who was connected to Canada. I didn't know Peter Middleton. Mike Middleton's grandfather was a big hero for Canada, and that he worked with the United States. I didn't know anything about them, and it never came into my mind because I had no idea what the politics were at the time. But it was really bizarre to later find out that that's partly what it was about. So then I was walking past this Canada defense person or prosecuting person, and looked over at his documents because he had a huge stack on his desk. And as I walked by, at the very top of this stack that he had was the Willamette Week article. It was the front page. It said, "What happened when Camille Garrett fell for a monk?" He was given that information for a Canadian immigration hearing. And then the other thing that I was seeing on the documents from my own attorney was that officials were saying I was paranoid schizophrenic. So obviously I knew that the United States was feeding Canada a bunch of crap, and some of the Canadians were a part of that the entire time. They knew, and it was set up ahead of time. So then I'm in this van and was driven back to the border. And the judge had told me in court very clearly, you cannot come back to Canada for 1 year. So they forced me to leave my car. They forced me to abandon my car on Canadian territory. That was not Canadian property. My vehicle was not Canadian property. But since I guess they wanted to search it and confiscate all of my belongings and keep me from traveling or having a way to travel, they stole my car and told me that I couldn't go back to Canada for a year. And then I said, how do I get my car? And they said, well, maybe you have a friend go get it for you. Well, then I found out people were being encouraged, once I got back to the United States, they were being told not to go to Canada to help me get my car. And who can do that? It was like everybody's that I knew was a working person. There were only a couple of families that I knew and they had kids. They couldn't just take off time and drive all the way, hours. It was many hours into Canada, pick up my car and then go back. I mean, that's kind of like taking up vacation time. Not a lot of people use their vacation time to go on vacations for their family on scheduled days. They don't just have time to leave their jobs and families and make this huge trip to Canada and back. And my parents, I asked them if they would help, and they said no, they couldn't. And then I find out later, I mean, they have been under the thumb of the FBI, CIA, and military all along. So nobody wanted me to have my car back. They always knew that I wasn't going to get my car back. And that was another method of blocking my freedom of movement and my travel. And so I was very clear about how I needed to get someone to help me get my car. I mean, he just, actually, I don't think I asked that judge that. All that judge told me was the judge only said, you can't come back to Canada for a year. And then after the Canadians dropped me off at the border, I was then at the United States border with the Border Patrol there. And Raul Buhanda worked as a Border Patrol employee before he was FBI. And suddenly I was, at the Border Patrol station and running into people that were trying to do him favors and were mad at me for reporting him. And the Border Patrol there told me, I said, what do I do about my car? I need to get my car. And they said, I can't go back there for a year. And he said, well, you need to go check with, he made a phone call, or he said, he went out of the room for a minute, and then he came back to me and he said, you need to go back to the Canadian Border Patrol, which was like a couple yards away, and ask them, go over to their station and ask them what you need to do to get your car back. And I had already just explained to this man, I said, I can't go to Canada for a year. So I was very clear and told him, and then I asked him, I said, well, I can go over to that border station? And he said, yeah, it's all neutral. So I was being told this was all neutral territory, and it wouldn't be like going into Canada to go to the Canadian border station, because that border station was before Canada started. I mean, to my knowledge, there was like, you got your border station with the U.S., then you have a little neutral strip of lawn, and then you had the Canadian border station. And I don't think that you're in Canada until you cross over past the border station, because as far as I know, when I was leaving the United States to go into Canada, I had to go past the Canadian border person before I was considered to be technically in Canada, because prior to that point I wasn't in Canada. So common sense would say going to the Canadian border station is not going into Canada unless you go past that border station. And I went to that border station, and then I was harassed by the guards there, and they said, you were told, I said, I need to find out. I was told by the U.S. Border Patrol that I have to come over here to find out how to get my car. And this man, there were two men standing there at the counter,